Hi, everybody. My name is Miles, and I'm with Peak Performers. I'm a disability inclusion partner here at Peak Performers. And at the beginning of 2026, I started off a new series called Disability Idea, which is meant to explore various different ideas where maybe the community hasn't necessarily found consensus or there's not a single answer around. And disability is a complex topic, which is why I'm excited to bring on Dr. Patricia Salibi on today, where she's going to be talking a little bit more about the medical model of disability and particularly how within the medical community we might be able to update the definitions and the codes that are used that ultimately make huge implications on how we receive health services here in the United States. So, having said that, I am so glad to bring on Patricia. Thanks for
Hi.
coming on today. Appreciate it.
Good morning from a very snowy St. Louis, Missouri.
It's, very chilly here in Texas too, 20 degrees, but that's for us, that's like the Arctic, it's just absolutely frigid here. So, I have a flight going out today, and I'm like, "I hope I can actually make it to the airport." So, how's everything up your way?
It's okay. I think the roads were pretty much shut down. Schools are closed today. A lot of people, a lot of businesses closed, but maybe it's a good thing with everything going on in the world. We have a chance to sit back, reflect, share some quality time with loved ones, and so forth.
Couldn't agree more. Well, thank you for coming on today. And by the way, for anybody that is joining us live, feel free to drop a comment into the chat to introduce yourself. Let's take this as an opportunity to connect with each other and introduce yourself to the other people that happen to be watching. But let's just dive right into it. Well, first off, Patricia, go ahead and introduce yourself and particularly your field of study.
Sure. I am a professor of social work at Bradley University, which is in Peoria, Illinois, situated halfway between St. Louis and Chicago, for those who aren't familiar with Bradley. And I am a longtime consultant with the World Health Organization. I started when I was a student at Washington University. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the classification called ICF that I was a part of developing. And since that point, I have continued my work promoting the idea of looking at functioning and transforming healthcare to look at functioning and the environment as a better way to shift us away from this idea of diagnosis only defines us and should be the only mechanism to identify us as a person with a disability or a person without a disability. So this is something really important to me. And I co-chair right now the Functioning Disability Reference Group for the WHO, but I also serve in various collaborative roles, such as serving to represent the International Federation of Social Workers and social development issues at the United Nations. So there's a few of the things that I do, and I'm also the editor of the Health and Social Work Journal. So a few things that I'm very proud of.
Awesome. Thank you. And I
Hello.
Hey,
Oh,
Patricia, can you hear me?
yes, I can. I think with the
Okay.
there's some power outages issues, so I apologize.
Oh, no worries. I'm not sure if it was on my end or your end, but again, we're dealing with winter storm, so we'll just bear with it. Well, let's kind of dive right into it.
Sure.
And the reason I was excited to talk to you is because I've been told by multiple people over the course of my other interviews this year that they've gone to the doctor, and there's definitely something that happens when they do get a diagnosis, especially if it's a diagnosis that maybe doctors don't understand a lot about, or maybe it's something that's commonly misunderstood within the wider community. And sometimes I've even heard people relate to me that, well, don't get that diagnosis from your doctor, or, I'm not going to give you that because that's going to change the entire course of your health outcome. And to add a little bit more context to that, whenever we go in and we do get a diagnosis, it's relayed in the form of a single medical code, but this doesn't exactly have a lot of nuance to it. So, for example, it does not take into account overall health of the person, overall age of the individual. It doesn't take in any kind of other kinds of things. So, you would be an argument of switching that code over and providing a little bit more context. But tell me about that.
Absolutely. I actually did a recent TEDx talk around the specific topic of what if your diagnosis was only the beginning, because it is only the beginning. And it basically tries to summarize your entire life situation, your lived experience, your identity into a single code. So, Miles, for example, if you and I both had diabetes, we would have the same code. It makes no sense because you and I, as we all know, would have very different life situations, and it's not reflective. There's no way to be able to describe that situation. As you mentioned, your entire health situation, the contextual factors like age, that we know personal factors influence health conditions, health status, health outcomes, the environment as well. So years ago, about 30 years ago, the WHO had a classification, and they actually create and maintain what's known as the ICD. It's the International Classification of Diseases, that has all of these codes. So whenever you go to a doctor's office, they use the same system, no matter what healthcare system you are, where in the world, ICD. And the same codes are used regardless of where you are for that particular condition, the injury, the disorder, the disease, and so forth. Mental health conditions as well are included. We decided it didn't make sense. So 30 years ago, we were already thinking about this. Why not complement that, if you will, with another classification? And what we did was stakeholders, including persons with disabilities and family members, clinicians, policymakers, you name it, sat around for several years, and we created what is now known as the ICF. I have this little red book here, which there is an electronic version online. It's all public access information. So you can Google it and get to the WHO website to find out what's in that red book. But it became the International Classification of Functioning, Disability, and Health. In it has the entire realm of body functions and structures, but also activities and participation around 9 domains, everything that you can think of, including things related to work and employment, because I know you were interested in workplace accommodations. And then when we were developing this classification around functioning, we sat around, and I'm a social worker, so I thought about things in my classroom like person and environment approaches and very person-centered approaches. I thought, how can we build a classification on functioning without bringing in the environment? And I wasn't alone. Other clinical professionals were also in the room saying the same thing. So we were able to get WHO to create an environmental task force. I'm very proud of being part of that. And we created a section on environment. So it includes all those things that you think about in the environment, built environment, attitudes, personal support, and so forth, that we need to better understand functioning. Because sometimes, and for those of us who are on the call, who are persons with disabilities or work with persons with disabilities, you know that the disabling element can actually be what's in the environment. It's not what is with that particular person in terms of their health condition. So this is really important to shift this. Here we are. This year is actually the 25th anniversary of the ICF being ratified by the United Nations and having been approved by the World Health Assembly. And we are now seeing momentum in this country, but certainly in other parts of the world, to actually using this and integrating it fully into our healthcare system.
Thank you for providing that context right there. And if when we stick with our current system that only has a singular diagnostics, a singular code, what are some of the impacts that happens when you go to future medical appointments?
Well, you think about it, you even said a little bit about how sometimes individuals don't want a certain code, they don't want a certain diagnosis. I think with diagnosis, it's a very deficit-based system, right? It's an idea of getting labeled, and then with that diagnosis comes assumptions, and it goes beyond just clinical judgment. I think there's a lot of wonderful doctors and nurses and other clinical professionals out there, but often what we find ourselves is getting trapped in the idea of what you can't do based on that diagnostic code. And if you listen to my TEDx talk, you get a little bit of understanding of my story as a person with a disability and why this is so important to me and has become my life passion, is understanding that we can't do this anymore. We need to shift from what people can't do to what people can do. And moving to a functioning based systems moves us away from a deficit model. It moves us actually to a more neutral model, if you will, where everybody functions in their daily lives. And we know that everybody's functioning varies from day to day. It's a very, I think, a better system, a more holistic system to use as we're looking at healthcare.
And to provide a little bit more context to other people that are watching out there that might not be familiar, there are multiple different models for disability out there, right? And historically, a lot of times, disability has been seen through, say, for example, a religious model where a disability is a result of a sin or it's a result of some kind of karma situation, right? Like there's something bad that happened or bad that you did that therefore is the result of your disability. And that's where we get a lot of that pre-existing bias and discrimination elements that are naturally baked into our systems too. Then we have the medical model of disability, which really looks at disability as you described as a loss, as something that's wrong with the person, and doctors are often approaching it towards how can I fix this person. Most recently, though, many people have realized that disability is just part of their identity, and the fact that we have access to modern medicine, modern technology, and modern accommodations just means that more people with disabilities can live and participate within our society to the fullest extent. And many more people are realizing that they aren't necessarily even ashamed of their disability. You start looking at things like the neurodiversity movement, and there are so many people out there that are embracing that difference within their brain, which might be seen as a deficit within certain contexts, but they're saying, this is part of me. This is something that I'm proud of. And this is something that is unique to my particular experience. However, it is important that we update those medical models because many people with disabilities feel a constant sense of tension whenever they go into the doctor's office, especially if they live again with like those chronic medical illnesses or maybe things that we haven't quite figured out a complete solution for. Oftentimes, there's a state of disbelief. Oftentimes, there's a state of friction that happens every time they go into the doctor's office. And the doctor might be looking at it strictly from the lens of how can I fix you when that necessarily isn't the case, right?
Absolutely. How can you fix certain types of health conditions? There are no cures for a lot of things. So we need to move beyond this medical model. I think in the medical and healthcare community, we are seeing this. We're seeing a shift, I think, in part because of the recognition of social determinants of health and social drivers of health, commercial determinants of health. The idea that we're not achieving those health outcomes, and we have to figure out why. And so I think a lot of medical scholars and researchers have stepped back to think about what's going on, and they realize that what is affecting often health outcomes really isn't related to that health condition, or I say health very broadly, mental health condition, behavioral health condition, and so forth. It's that environment, right? It's the fact that, if you are prescribing medication for a child who's come into the ER and then that child comes back worse 3 weeks later, you wonder what happened. Well, and then you talk to the parent and they find out that they couldn't afford that medication because they don't have health insurance, for example, right? So there's a lot of things that we know that are happening, and we need a system that's more robust to account for it. The ICF is going to allow us to do this. And fortunately, it's already happening. For the last few years, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid is actually working. They have a community group called PASIO, which is Post-Acute Care Interoperability Resources. So they are looking at health interoperability. And this is what's driving this right now. And the idea that we have to capture more information because diagnostic codes are not sufficient. So functioning, how do we capture that? I'm very happy to report, if you will, that we're coding everything to ICF codes in terms of functional status. And then there's another group, it's what we call Fire Accelerator Project called Gravity, looking at social determinants of health, how we can bring those codes into the EHRs as well. So we're already working on it. And when I say we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of people around the country and around the world that are invested in this to make it happen. Once we have the system in place, you mentioned technology, of course, very vital. We're going to be able to start capturing this information. We're already capturing it. We're capturing, for example, functional assessments. If you go to a social worker, an occupational therapist, a physiotherapist, we're capturing that functional information. It's just that we're not translating it, communicating it, coordinating it in a similar manner. The ICF allows us to do this consistently. It will allow us to share communication, information across clinical settings, including someone's home, for example, once they're discharged from a hospital in this case, it will allow us to be able to code it, translate it. It's a wonderful system, and it is what we call harmonized on the same system as the ICD, those diagnostic codes. So everything will work together.
That's interesting. And I'm curious too, how do you think this will shape the identity of people with disabilities? Because something that I've observed is that trying to capture everybody that has a disability under a single bracket, which, by the way, has an unfortunate tendency to take over the identity of that person, especially if it's an observable disability. They. Uh, Oftentimes what happens is that all of these things are lumped together. So a person with hearing loss, a person that's missing an arm, a person that has a mental health disorder such as depression, they're all lumped into this large category called disability. So do you think that we'll start to see a further fragmentation of identities due to result of functioning?
I I want to say I would hope so. I think that when you have this deficit-based diagnostic model, you can't help but to put people in that code, right, into that group. And so what you don't embrace is the idea there's so much rich diversity and differences with people. And so moving to that functional based model to say everybody functions, right, in some way, some form, some shape, to understand there's so much differentiation when we look at that particular functioning based model. And I think that might help move us into the right direction to say, this person is not identified by a single code, by a single condition, but rather let's look at what's going on in that person's lives. I think we live in a society where we really reinforce this, disabled enough bias, as we've talked about. You and I have had conversations about it, by reinforcing this idea that we have to prove our disability. I mean, if you are a member, and I identify in various ways, I'm multiracial, I don't have to prove that I'm Asian. When I go into a doctor's office, I check a box. We actually, when we convene a group, and it's actually under right now consideration, is the idea to move disability out of assessment categories when we think about medical records, and move it into that demographic category where I really believe it should be. And I know this doesn't necessarily agree with everybody, right? But the idea is, if you go to a doctor's office, you should be able to say, I'm a person with a disability. And as a result of that self-identification, you should be entitled for certain things in
Hmm.
terms of accommodations and so forth. In terms of the assessment category, we should use functioning. Functioning is already there, but so is disability. And to me, it's kind of counterintuitive. We should just keep functioning to show what we might need in terms of support, whether it's in someone's school environment, home environment, work environment, society. What are those things that we need? What are the things that we need to do, let's say in terms of therapy, right, in terms of improving their activities and their functioning, but also the environment. If we're looking at going into their home, for example, or returning them to home after perhaps hip surgery. So it just makes sense to me that we move into that particular direction. We move away from deficit-based assessments, this idea of having to prove one's disability or inability to do something. And I think it will move us in a positive direction. It will move us into a right direction, if you will.
Interesting. And kind of going back to that phrase that you mentioned there, disabled enough, because I think that that is something that outside the disability community, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But to try to add a little bit more context for people, the Americans with Disabilities Act actually does not have a definitive list of here's all the disabilities that are out there. And the reason for that is that, again, there are some mysterious conditions that exist out there, and there are some things that it really is dependent. So, for example, if you were to take glasses, that might be disabling if you have moderate vision loss, if you didn't have access to glasses. But the fact that there's no stigma attached to it and the fact that it's ubiquitously available for relatively cheap to almost all people means that it's not disabling in that way, right? So the ADA has a lot of context to it because it allows some of the things. And most recently, they added long COVID, which is a very disabling condition for many individuals that causes them to have to sequester themselves for long periods of time. And where most of us might get a sniffle out of it, they have something that lasts for months, if not years, affecting them and making them more likely to get other kinds of respiratory diseases too. So disabling enough, but going back to that, I remember that I was on a call with somebody within compliance within a large nonprofit network. And I remember that I sat down with them to kind of understand exactly how what they would accept for disability for work. And they said, okay, so it has to be covered under the ADA. It has to be something that affects something that you would experience at work, and then finally, you have to be receiving an accommodation from your workplace. And I said, hold on a second. So I pulled out the hearing aids from my ear and set them on the table. I'm like, this is covered under the ADA. I have hearing loss, right? Profound hearing loss in the upper ranges. Most of my upper ranges are wiped out. Secondly, it affects communication within the workplace. Without these, it makes it very difficult to hear. However, I get my accommodations through vocational rehabilitation, not through my employer. So would I be covered to work under your program and to fulfill the contractual requirements? And they said no.
Mhm.
And the challenge that I run into again and again is that we have so many different people and so many different organizations that define disability differently, and oftentimes it comes down to that concept of disabled enough. Sometimes they'll even use the words severely disabled, which does not exist within the ADA at all. So I guess my concern with having a functioning based system right here is that this would only feed into that element where they're choosing to, frankly, deny services to certain people with disabilities because they are not disabled enough. So, how do we take that into account as we deploy something like this?
Well, I think, first we have to get it implemented and we have to try, we have to see what happens. And I think a lot of it is raising awareness and educating people. I think when we have our current system, what we're doing is we're relying on people, certain people, maybe clinicians, for example, are probably the prime example, and their determination, right? Because they have to determine whether you are disabled or not. And, for some cases in some states, as we know, it's a judge who's doing this kind of thing. So, moving to maybe a functional based assessment where we can train clinicians, making sure, and we already know clinicians are doing functional based assessment. It's just coordinating it and standardizing it. And I think that is the key. And many times I've sat around a room with other clinical professionals and we've been able to talk and then use the ICF to kind of standardize that communication and understand that each of us in our respective field are using some different types of mechanism to determine someone's functioning, but then we can pull it all together using the ICF and what we call as crosswalk a lot of what we're finding into the relevant codes. So there's a way to be able to do this. And in fact, the ICD right now, the latest version, we use in a version of the 10th version in the United States, and we use a clinical modification. But there is a ICD 11 that was developed by WHO, and we developed it specifically for electronic health records. And we actually include functional based information in it because we know this is so important. And we're trying it out, if you will. So we have an ability to look at it. I think if we were able to change the mindset of people to realize that certain disabilities are sufficient versus others, severity shouldn't be necessarily looked at. I've just been proposing to utilize the system. There are qualifiers, kind of getting into what you're talking about. But I think we should just go with the model of if we can use an ICF-based system to identify what is going on in terms of someone's functioning, determine where there might be issues and barriers, for example, hindering that functioning. So let's say in the workplace, there is an essential job task that needs to be done. If we are able to assess whether that person can do it or not, and we see that that person's having perhaps difficulty in accomplishing that task, then looking at what is it that's causing the issue. And it could be, as you know, a number of things. This is your area, workplace accommodations. That it could be a long list, but we're doing this already in employment settings, right? We're doing this already for everyone, quite frankly. It's just that if you're a person with a disability, we want to hide behind this particular system. I think, and it masks the fact that we are already looking at, are people doing their job, yes or no? And if they're not doing their job or doing it well, in terms, I know that's subjective, but based on whatever kind of baseline or criteria that's used in that particular contextual work setting, but how do we help them get better, right? And this is the whole purpose of performance evaluations, right? Annual appraisals and things like that. So we should be, I think, looking at this kind of approach when we are trying to help persons with disabilities or differences in functioning be able to do better in the workplace. So what is it? Is it that they don't understand because the guidelines or the instructions are not clear? Is it because they require a different assistive device or a chair? We know, like, a lot of people have asked for different types of chairs, right? Because sitting for too long hurts their back, for example, and exacerbates maybe a health condition. So it's that environment that needs to be modified. So it isn't their health condition that's the issue per se, right? It's that interaction between that individual and their health condition. So I think really understanding, can we work with people, raise awareness, educate them, and create this kind of more neutralized system where we are looking at how do we accommodate everyone in the workplace in terms of their functioning. And that might be looking to their environment to understand what needs to be changed.
Hmm. Looking at the environment to see what needs to be changed. I agree with that. I think that that really is critical. And I think that so much of the disability is situational based off of environment and how much it impacts somebody. I oftentimes am a fan of using observable disabilities instead of invisible disabilities because I think that that's more apropos. So, for example, observable might be somebody that is missing an arm or might be somebody that's missing a leg. But as a perfect example, I have a friend of mine who works in high tech, and he's been remote for as long as he's worked for this particular employer. And every single day he sits behind a desk. And so his coworkers don't even realize that he does not have one of his legs. And so, and this came up recently because he was invited to come to a company picnic and he declined the invitation because he didn't want people to see him differently too. So I think it's so valuable to think about the context. And to give you another example, I have another friend that has a non-observable disability until the moment that he opens his mouth. He speaks with a stutter, and so it's posed as a barrier for him in being able to get job offers because the moment that he goes onto a phone interview, people might perceive him differently the moment that he opens his lips too. So it really is so tricky and so situational, all these various different elements that go into crafting what is the disability, how is it playing an impact, and how can we best support that person?
Absolutely. And I do think it is about raising awareness. Once we then adopt a system, right, we have to raise awareness about the system. We have to, provide direction to people, help them understand what we're doing. But the thing is, we're already doing it. We're already looking at function. Oh, you talk about vocational rehab people. They're looking at functioning based assessments in the workplace. That's what they do. It's just that they don't have a way to perhaps code it and classify it in, let's say, electronic health records, right? And
Yeah.
we know, and like I said, this is really what's driving a lot of this change, is the idea that someone's life doesn't stop after after they leave the hospital. And in fact, we're living longer with chronic conditions. We need to look at how do we support people longer term. And so we need to shift, and this is my soapbox, we need to shift away from these traditional indicators in this country and throughout the world of morbidity and mortality only. And we need to add this third indicator, and I'm not alone, on functioning, to understand that, because the majority of what people are doing is living their life after they get a diagnosis of a health condition, a mental health condition, and so forth. How do we support that person? And we know they're going to actively engage in employment, very likely. They're going to continue to be part of society, participating in a variety of community events. How do we support that person in their life experience and do it well? And so that's really, and another thing I want to touch on, you mentioned, is that the situations where we don't have a definitive diagnosis. I had a case of one of my children, and this was the case where basically things stopped, because in our healthcare system, if you don't have a diagnosis, it's problematic. And so sometimes they'll just assign a random diagnostic category or code that's undefined, but that's problematic, right? Because that diagnosis really is the ticket to getting services, whether it's in a school system, whether it's at workplace accommodations, society in general. If we stop doing this and we realize that what we really need to be looking at someone's functioning, right?
Mm.
Then how do we actually treat the person, if you will? How do we intervene to help them in that particular contextual situation, to whatever issue that might be that's resulting in terms of their functioning? So this has a lot of value, but it's going to take a shift, a transformation, to get our minds around actually using a system like this.
And I want to give a quick shout out to some of the folks that have joined us live. To Thomas Maribo, he says, "We see you, Trish." And
Oh, hi, Thomas. He's from Denmark. He's one of my WHO pals.
oh, cool, righto. And we have Mustafa Rafat. He says exactly, and then an anonymous LinkedIn user that says strength approach. Uh,
Absolutely. This is a
yeah.
strengths-based approach. You know, a lot of what I talked about, my values as a social worker, were embedded in helping me make recommendations and chime in. I'm not too shy, as you probably already know, and I advocate for changes when we built the ICF system. And it's from a very strengths-based approach. I think that is the key, is that where we can understand that we move beyond the deficit model to functioning more positive, more neutral, if you will. We need to reframe that clinical encounter. We need to stop saying that clinicians are the people who can make this determination. We know as people with disabilities, we know ourselves the best, right? And so we have authority, we have expertise through our lived experience. And so this really should be a collaboration between that clinical professional and the person themselves, or maybe by extension, a family member, right? In certain cases, as we know, advocating maybe for a child with a disability. So I think this is important as we kind of shift the focus to making sure that we have a better system.
So the last question that I have for you is, how would the functioning model take into account dynamic disability? So, for example, somebody might live with a mental health disorder, and for 99% of the time, they're doing completely fine. They take their medication once a day. They are careful about what they eat. They make sure that they exercise, move their body, that they stay in social contact. But then one day they have a traumatic life event, or maybe their body changes and their medication needs change, and then all of a sudden they cannot get out of bed the next day, and that goes on for a week, and this causes a job loss. For example, this causes them to be disconnected from many of their family and friends that are out there. So how would this model take into account dynamic disabilities that change from one day or one week to the next?
That's a great example. It works better when you have a diagnostic system. You are trapped within that code, and I
Okay.
think you're trapped under the understanding that you're going to function this way. It doesn't allow for more flexibility, if you will, for more differentiation. But a functioning based system will, because when you look at the ICF model, and there's like a model in here, a framework, you'll see there are arrows that are going bi-directional in different ways, because we understand that there is a continuum of
Mm.
functioning, that you don't necessarily function right here every day of your life, that you might shift this way, you might shift that way. We know health, mental health conditions, behavioral health conditions, you wake up and sometimes you have a good day. Sometimes you're not having that great of a day, right? And
Mhm.
so, and if some of it's the environment, sometimes it's just that particular condition that's manifesting itself in a certain way that particular day, like a flare up, for example, right?
Mhm.
Or a lot of pain that day that's just not manageable. So having this functioning based system will allow us to recognize that it is a dynamic process, that
Mm.
functioning is a very real experience, experienced by everyone. That's the thing. That's that neutrality that comes in it. The idea that everyone functions in their daily lives. And we know, even if you don't have a diagnosable health condition, you can have interruptions, if you will, in your functioning. There can
Mm.
be things that are going on, whether it's brought on by the environment or just yourself, you're just not feeling quite right before, right? We know this is what brings people to the doctors when they don't function well, and they go, something is wrong, right? And they don't have that diagnosis yet. And so they have to go through this particular system. So I think this is really important. You know, I have a child who has a traumatic brain injury. So she has what's known as a 504 plan. Many of us on the call will probably know this, and it's in place. And so basically, to get that 504 plan, right, she had to have a diagnosable disability to qualify for it. And that was the starting point. Then we sit down and what did we talk about? The whole, she was there. I was there as a parent, her teachers, the counselor, the disability coordinator was there for the school district. And we sat down and talked about where the issues were in her functioning. And then we created this 504 plan based on how do we support her in that school environment so that she could actually function better, right? And look to the environmental barriers, look to ways that we could intervene accordingly. So we're actually, again, another example of how we're already doing it. It's just that we don't have a consistent system to kind of capture it. And utilizing this and putting it in a system across, this is the great thing, across healthcare, across workplace accommodations and employment settings, across school settings, community. It is a way that we can utilize the same system consistently. And so I think there's, again, just another example of how I think there are value if we were able to utilize a functioning based approach. Very relevant. In this case, it would have been great for my daughter in her school setting because, as you were just saying, some days things change. And because this was, from getting hit by a car in 2023, things change. And so even the update process, which in school systems, it's an annual update process, doesn't make sense because it doesn't, change doesn't happen on a specific day of the year. So we'll find that some days, and in this case, she started getting severe migraines and headaches and dizziness. And so we had to take her back to the neurologist, and she's under neurological care to say, what else do we need? And we need to modify that 504 plan accordingly. So this is a way that we can understand. I think it also will help people in decision-making positions, will help people in authority positions to understand that, it isn't just a one-time all kind of thing, that we know that it is very dynamic, as you mentioned, I'm going to use your words, that it's ever changing, and to maybe give it a little bit more flexibility as a result. So hopefully now, we'll have the framework, we'll have the classification, we'll have the technology, we'll have it to back this idea up in various settings, whether, again, school, home, workplace, community.
Well, thank you very much, Patricia. I really appreciate your insights today. I will include a link to Patricia's full TED Talk where she talks more extensively about this.
It was the first time I actually talked about my my health condition, which was diagnosed when I was a child, like a teenager, and then really worsened in college. So you'll learn a little bit more about my life trajectory and the changes that were made as a result of a doctor who really based his clinical decision on my diagnosis rather than my functioning. So, just understanding where I'm coming from and how it has affected my own life as well. I think there's just, as I mentioned, a lot of value for understanding people's life situations and their lived experiences. And I think we just need to start listening to people.
I love that. Great note to end on. Anything else that you would like to direct people towards for further information, Patricia?
Well, I mentioned the TEDx talk, but there is a set of courses on ICF. If you are more on the academic research side, you can check those out. They're offered through Physiopedia, which is a charity out of the UK. They do a lot of rehabilitation training, and they are all offered on sliding scales, depending on where you live in the world. You might have access to that. So Physiopedia, I can share the link with you, Miles, later on.
Sounds good. All right. Thanks, everybody that joined us live as well. This has been Miles from Peak Performers. Thanks for joining us for this Disability Idea.